Welcome to Walking with Jesus Bible Study. We're going to be in the book of Psalms, chapter 84, verse 10. Do I have it on there? Yeah, I have it. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. I'm going to repeat that. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. The company that we keep greatly impact not only our salvation and our joy, but our peace. We could have the greatest comforts and luxuries, but if we're surrounded by evil and mistreatment, we'll still be miserable. Our joy, our peace comes from the Lord. If we do not have those, if we're not surrounded by His presence and people who reflect the same light that we do, we're reflecting their energies, what they have upon them. So if they're surrounded and they're possessed or they have evil spirits in them, guess what is going to leak onto us? Their evilness, their habits, their ways. You know, they say you are what you eat. The same thing goes true to whatever you listen to, whatever you watch, whatever you read. So whoever you surround yourself with, their presence shapes you. And the reason why it said it can have an effect on your salvation is because when you keep constantly being around that type and their type of habits and characteristics and stuff, they can corrupt who you are by accident. There's many people who are really good and kind-hearted people, but they was either bullied or wasn't too much into the in crowd or what have you not. And so the moment, we've all seen the movies, stuff like Mean Girls and all those ones where they take the one that's the nerd and then try to make it all popular. I mean, you got the movie Jawbreakers, the movie Heathers. They're constantly teaching you that you end up acting and becoming the very thing, sometimes the very thing that you can't stand and hate, all because you're just hanging around them. You know, as parents, we try to tell our kids when they're young, don't be hanging around those gang members and those so-called drug dealers and this and that. And even though, like, Mom, I'm not going to be like them. There's many of good people who is at the wrong place at the wrong time, who had very bad things happen to them. There's many men who are sitting in prison right now that didn't do anything, but was simply in the car with somebody who had just committed a crime. And because they were their friends, and even though they don't go with them to do the crime, they still on occasion hang out with those people. They can go commit a crime on the way to come pick you up. And even though they're just giving you a ride somewhere and dropping you off because, they're your so-called friends, they could have committed a crime, picked you up while leaving that crime, because it takes a minute for cops to respond. So by the time the cops are caught on to them, now you are now in the car. And by the time they get pulled over, how are you going to explain to the officer that you didn't do anything, that they had just picked you up, that you wasn't there? There's many people sitting in prison right now because of circumstances just like that. It's sad to say, even the community that you live in, People treat people by prejudging. There's many of innocent people right now just because of their circumstances in the community that they happen to live in, or by the color of their skin. That people is like, oh, you know what? Well, you come from this area, so I'm going to say, yes, you probably did commit this and you probably already did this. Well, you know what? We're missing this and you're the only black person here, so we're just going ahead and assume that you did it because you know how people tend to do. Some people can't help it. That's why we need to stay prayed up and be in the Word of God so that God can protect us and help us. And sometimes He puts us in situations that we just can't help. But we got to see the bigger picture. We got to stay. We're being tested. But you've got to pay attention. You got to pay attention to who you hang around with and what are you doing. Now Jesus, you know, the Pharisees sit there and said, why are you eating with these sinners, these tax collectors and all this and that? Didn't Jesus hang around such people trying to help them? Of course He did. Of course He did. But he had changed them. He was healing them. He was fixing them. And some people, God forbid, but it does happen, are trying to do and set an example and lead by Jesus' example. And so therefore they do still hang around certain bad crowds thinking that they can just get the Word of God in them because they're trying to save their souls. But we can't save everybody. And we can't save every soul. So sometimes it is very misfortunate because we are doing the work of God and we are being around certain types of people because we're just simply doing as God asks us to do. And we can't help the circumstances or change the events. But this is particularly talking about people who purposely hang around certain people. And they ain't sitting there trying to do the work of God. They ain't sitting there preaching and teaching the Word. They're doing it for their own reasons. To get into the popular group. To be cool. To do this and that. There's a major difference between the two. And that's why I mentioned both circumstances, because there's going to be people who say, oh, well, Jesus did this, and sometimes you are. And yes, that is true. But this is specifically talking about purposely hanging around, purposely watching things that you know you should not be watching, purposely listening to music that you should not be listening to, because it has an effect. Your ears and your eyes are portals. Whatever you feed into your body, you are feeding into your soul. So these things that you are willingly and purposely doing that is not of God will have an effect on you. The more you do it, the more it becomes a habit. And habits are harder to break than just simply just doing something. There's some people who just can't find the time to be with God and to get in the Word, but they start making it a habit. They'll realize that the more time that they have for such things that they claim that they did not obviously have time for. So you got to feed your soul what God is asking you to feed it. You got to make sure it is the Word of God. You got to make sure you're surrounded by others who have the same like-minded and same spirit as you, so that you don't be possessed, so to speak, by their bad habits, by their negative energy, and get caught up into the spider web. Because that's what it does. Purposely. And you're not sitting there trying to change them, preach to them. You can get caught in the web because somebody's preaching to somebody. So if you ain't preaching